Have you ever sat alone, in the quiet, and had a thought so honest it scared you a little? A thought about who you really are, about why you feel so different from everyone around you, about why your mind never seems to just stop. You've had thoughts like that. Everyone who's ever truly paid attention has. But here's what nobody tells you. You've probably never said any of it out loud. Not to your friends, not to your family, maybe not even to yourself, not fully. Because somewhere along the way, you learned that thinking too much makes people uncomfortable. That the world moves fast, and it doesn't wait for you to sit with your thoughts. So people stop asking the deep questions. They silence that voice inside them, just to keep up, just to fit in. But one man spent his entire life listening to that exact voice, the one most people learn to shut down. His name was Carl Jung. And today we're going to talk about why the ones who think too deeply were never broken. They were built with a power the rest of the world is still trying to find. Your brain wasn't built to make you comfortable. It was built to keep you alive. Every question you can't stop asking yourself. Why did they say that? What did that silence mean? What's really going on beneath the surface of things? That isn't a glitch. That's an ancient system, still running in the background of a modern mind, scanning everything for what could hurt you before it happens. For most of human history, the people who noticed the small details, the shift in someone's tone, the thing left unsaid, the danger hiding behind a smile, those were the ones who survived. The ones who didn't look too closely, often didn't get a second chance, so your mind learned to look closely at everything. Even now, when there's no danger in the room, just a conversation replaying in your head at 1 a.m. But here's the part almost nobody says out loud. You've felt this happening your whole life, and you've almost never told anyone the full truth of it. Not because you don't have the words, but because the one time you did try to explain it, you probably watched someone's eyes glaze over. Or worse, you saw that flicker of, why can't you just relax? So you learned to package it, smaller, simpler, acceptable. You gave people the summary. You kept the real version, the one running underneath, 20 layers deep, for yourself. That's not a flaw in you. That's a mind doing exactly what it was built to do. And almost a century ago, one man became obsessed with that exact hidden layer, the part of the mind running underneath what people show the world. He didn't study it from a distance. He turned it on himself first. His name was Carl Jung. Changed the way we understand the human mind forever. Carl Jung wasn't just another psychologist writing papers in a quiet office. He was a man who spent years standing at the edge of his own mind, willing to look at parts of himself most people spend a lifetime avoiding. He trained under Freud, worked beside him, and then walked away from him, because Jung believed the mind wasn't just about desire and repression. He believed every person carries an entire hidden world inside them. A world with its own logic, its own symbols, its own truth. He called it the unconscious. And he didn't just study it in others, he mapped his own. For years, Jung recorded his own dreams, sat with visions most people would call unsettling and refused to look away, while his colleagues built careers keeping their distance from the mind's darker corners. Jung walked straight into his. And what he found there led him to a conclusion that still unsettles people today. He believed the ones who feel too much, who question too much, who can't switch their minds off at the end of the day, weren't malfunctioning. He believed they were closer to something most people never reach. He called it individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, underneath every mask you've ever worn to survive. Jung didn't see deep thinking as a burden to manage. He saw it as a signal. A sign that a part of you was already trying to grow into something the surface version of you hasn't caught up to yet. Which raises a question most people never ask themselves. If this constant thinking, this constant noticing isn't a flaw in you, what is it actually trying to become? Here's something most people get backwards. They think the goal of life is to feel settled, comfortable, finished. To reach some final version of yourself and just stay there. Jung didn't believe that. He believed you were never meant to arrive anywhere. He believed you were meant to keep becoming layer after layer for your entire life. And it wasn't a gentle, peaceful unfolding. He described it as one of the hardest things a person can go through, because it asks you to meet the parts of yourself you spent years avoiding. Think about it. Every time you replay a conversation, searching for what it really meant, you're not being dramatic. You're trying to understand something true. Every time you sit in a room full of people and still feel that ache of not quite belonging, that's not weakness. That's a part of you refusing to settle for a version of connection that isn't real. Jung believed the mind that won't stop questioning is a mind that's already outgrowing the life it was handed. Not the life it chose, the life it was handed. By family, by culture, by every voice that told you who to be, before you were old enough to ask. Most people never go looking for what's underneath that. They accept the surface version of themselves and call it done. But you haven't been able to do that. Something in you keeps digging, keeps asking why, keeps noticing what everyone else agreed to stop noticing a long time ago. Jung had a word for the parts of yourself you push down to be accepted by the world. He called it the shadow, and he believed the people who think the deepest are usually the ones closest to actually meeting theirs. The hidden half of who they are, waiting to be acknowledged instead of buried. That's not a curse. That's the beginning of becoming whole. Because a person who never questions anything, never has to face themselves, but you do. Every single day, in the quiet moments nobody else sees. Which means all this thinking you've been taught to apologize for might actually be the most honest work you've ever done. The question is, what happens once you stop running from it? So what happens once you stop running from it? Something changes, quietly but completely. You stop treating your own mind like a problem to fix. The overthinking, the noticing, the questions that never let you rest. You stop trying to shrink them down to fit into a world that told you they were too much. Because here's what Jung understood that most people never get told. The goal was never to think less. The goal was to stop being afraid of what your thinking finds. Every uncomfortable realization you've ever had about yourself, the ones you pushed down, the ones you've never said out loud to anyone, those weren't signs that something is wrong with you. They were the beginning of you meeting the real version of yourself, the one underneath the performance, the one you've been protecting people from seeing. Jung believed that the moment you stop fighting that part of you is the moment you actually start becoming whole, not perfect, not finished, whole. A person who can hold their own darkness without flinching, who can sit with a hard question instead of numbing it away, who can feel everything, notice everything, and still choose to stay standing in it. That's not who you were told you had to be. That's who you already are, underneath everything you learned to hide. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You stop asking, why can't I just stop thinking about this? And you start asking something completely different. What is this thinking trying to show me? That single shift, that's where everything changes. So how do you actually start living this out? Jung never said the answer was to think less. He said the answer was to listen differently. Start here. When a thought keeps returning, the same worry, the same memory, the same question, circling back night after night, stop asking how to make it go away. Start asking what it's trying to tell you. Most of the thoughts you've been running from aren't random. They're pointing at something real, something asking to be faced instead of buried. Give yourself permission to sit in silence without reaching for a distraction. Jung spent years alone with his own mind, and what he found there terrified him at first. But he stayed, because he understood something most people never learn. The discomfort of sitting with your own thoughts is usually the doorway, not the danger. Write it down, not to explain it to anyone else, just for you. Jung filled entire journals with dreams, fears, questions he had no answers to yet. He was trying to know himself. There's a difference. One is fixing a problem. The other is finally paying attention to a person who's been waiting a long time to be heard. You. And when a thought feels too honest, too strange, too much to say out loud, don't shrink it down anymore. That thought isn't the flaw. It's the part of you that's already ahead of everyone else in the room. You don't need to think less. You need to stop being afraid of where your own mind is trying to take you. Carl Jung spent his whole life proving one thing. The people who think the deepest aren't broken. They're just the only ones brave enough to keep looking, long after everyone else stopped. So if any of this felt like it was talking directly to you, you already know why. If you're someone who thinks too deeply, drop a comment below that just says, "I think deep." And if you want more of this, more of the things nobody else says out loud, subscribe. Because this channel exists for minds like yours. Before you go, sit with this for a second. If nobody ever told you that thinking was too much, who would you actually be?